So the other part that I wanted to hit on that you jumped in on was, of course, Big 12 scheduling with the 4 newcomers on board in 2023. I haven't sat down to figure out whether this is feasible, but we talked about this a few weeks ago, whether the league would separate Oklahoma and Texas, have them only play current members of the league, keep them away from the 4 incoming members, and then have those 4 only play everybody else. I don't know if that's, I guess that's possible.
Yeah, I would think it would be. I would think it would be possible. I mean, probably not ideal, obviously, but I think that would be possible. I don't know, Mark. I mean, you have to think that. So as you think about this, when they put these schedules together, right? So they'll probably start putting these schedules together for next conference season. What early spring next year, maybe even late winter.
Yeah.
So I think again, this kind of lends to the idea that you feel like you would need to have a good solid understanding of what Oklahoma and Texas are doing by late summer this year to see if okay, are they going to be part of this new temporary 16 team Big 12 league, or are they going to be part of the new 16 team SEC league, starting in 2023. But and then to your point, if Oklahoma and Texas are still part of the Big 12 in this temporary 16 team league, does Oklahoma and Texas just play the other members that they traditionally played? Is there some sort of mix with playing some of these new members? How do you determine if you don't play if you don't play those teams? How do you determine who goes to the Big 12 championship game? Do they split these up into to conferences or to divisions? Which I think most teams are starting to go away from divisions, at least in terms of qualifications for the league championship, because I think the NCAA, I think it was this year, I mean earlier this summer or earlier this spring, that they had made the determination that you don't actually have to have there's not a requirement to have a winner from each division to have a championship game. So the top 2 teams, I think, in some of these conferences, they've already made the change that will be part of that conference championship. So I think those are a lot of questions that will have to be answered. So I think to a certain degree, Oklahoma and Texas are holding a couple of conferences here ransom in terms of what happens. And I know the SEC is very, very much in those conversations. Is probably at the end of the day they're making some of the decisions as well, along with ESPN. But like I said, that's why you don't think this will go much more than the end of summer, because there's some obviously decisions that have to be made sooner than later on what both of those conferences and their schedules and affiliations would look like.
I'm intrigued by what the results on the field will give fodder to in regards to conferences looking better or looking worse based on these changes. So if these 4 come into the league and they perform well while Oklahoma and Texas are still around, and there's just a lot of scenarios here that I would love to see play out. See these 4 come into the league, and if they get to play Texas and Oklahoma, what if those 4? Let's play this out for the 3 years that OU and Texas are supposed to be in the league, and let's say they play a collection of 12 games against those 4 teams in the span of, let's say they go 4-8. That's not going to happen, but I'm taking this to an extreme. If those 4 teams play well against Texas and Oklahoma before sending them off to the SEC, that gives the Big 12 a lot of future credibility. If the league's able to shut out Oklahoma and Texas, or not give them too many or allow them too many spots in the conference championship game in the next 3 years, that looks good for the league going forward. That this wasn't our league and it's leaving. On the flip side of Oklahoma and Texas, if Texas gets its act together and this is the championship game the last year or two that these teams are in the league, that's obviously not a good look for the Big 12 when the two championship participants move on. Likewise, just to put the SEC in its place to a certain extent, I would love Oklahoma and Texas to go into the SEC and play really well. So,
yeah, it's so intriguing on so many levels, Mark, and and even more so, what's the as you move forward into 2025 and things like that, what does the what's the national perception of this new Big 12 league? Right? Is it still one of those? I think there's certain belief that from a playoff perspective, there'll be some sort of automatic qualifier scenario come into play. Whether there's some stipulations around rankings and stuff like that around it, but still believe that there's going to be some sort of um, some sort of automatic qualifier. Is the Big 12, is the thought that this new Big 12 still has enough clout, has enough to get that automatic qualifier, and when you think about that, they don't have I mean, they're still considered a Power Five conference, obviously, but if that's not the case, do they cease from being a Power Five conference, anymore? So, I think that's going to be something else that's interesting when you think of, not a blue blood, um, per se, but a program that's been really solid over the last 10 years, Oklahoma State, right? Are they on kind of on the outside looking in? I mean, you could BYU kind of on the same side, not necessarily a blue blood, but one of a very known commodity in the college football world. So, yeah, so that'll be interesting as well. Not to mention the things that you mentioned also.
because you got to be careful of what you ask for. Uh, Maryland and Rutgers were nothing close to being football powers, but Maryland was a pretty successful mid-tier ACC team, and Rutgers was one of the best teams, a contending team in the Big East, and both of them are just getting kicked around in the Big Ten. Their overall records may not look too bad once they win some games out of conference, but their Big Ten records are horrible. They are
Mhm.
getting slaughtered for the most part. Nebraska, of course, made the last two Big 12 championship games, and they went into the Big Ten as a division winner their first year and gave up 70 points, and they haven't been heard from really since. They've gotten kicked around by the upper half of the Big Ten, and it's not been a successful transition, at least on the field for Nebraska. I don't know what the money standpoint looks like, except knowing that the Big Ten is right there with the SEC prior to this expansion in terms of money. So Nebraska's got to be making more money than the Big 12 teams are in revenue, but it's not been a great look for the football program for 10 or 12 years.
Yeah, no, you're. I mean, and I think that's. I mean, it's always a concern. I mean, I think a lot of Oklahoma people will think that they won't be subjected to that. I think the thing that Oklahoma has for its benefit, I think, is the change in administration from Lincoln Riley to Venables. I think is a good is a really really good situation. They're doing a lot of things that are preparing them for the move to the SEC. Not only from a football perspective, they've had a board of regents meeting this past month where they talked about and requested tons of improvements through all of the obviously football is part of it, but there's tons of improvements through all the sports programs at the University of Oklahoma just to get them ready for the SEC. So you've got examples, Mark, of some of these teams that have left the Big 12 and have been successful over the years, and then you've got another fair amount of these teams that have left the Big 12 and have not been real successful. When you look at Colorado, they've not really contended, to the degree that maybe and they even did it in the Big 12 or the Big 8 prior to that. Then you look at Nebraska, kind of the same situation. Texas A&M, as we talked about a little bit earlier, has been better than they were perennially with the Big 12. But you've got a lot of examples on both sides where to see what Oklahoma and Texas will be. I think, as we've mentioned, Texas is in a little bit more of a vulnerable spot just in terms of their success on the field than Oklahoma has over the last specifically over the last decade. It's something, there's going to be some teams that move around, and not just the Big 12, but as conference realignment, kind of continues to morph and get going, where some of these teams will end up being in better positions or will compete better than they were in their existing conference, but you'll still have these, to your point, your Marylands and Rutgers and Nebraskas and Colorados that don't compete as well as they did previously.